Tonight I'm really happy to introduce Elizabeth Eklund. She has received a master's degree in environmental science and another one in anthropology. She's currently working on her dissertation, and she does invite feedback from the board and the members of the audience tonight, and so she will be visiting this site next month. So if there's anything that you think would be interesting for her to take another look at or something new, she's really interested in feedback from all of you. But I am delighted to welcome her to speak this evening, and thank you all for being here.
All right, is mic working just fine? Perfect. Oops. All right, I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. As mentioned just a moment ago, I am Elizabeth, and I'd like to take a moment to thank our hosts. Is there a problem? Okay. As you know, we're on traditional land, so I'd like to thank the Tohono Nation, as well as the University of Arizona and the hospital here for allowing us to use their space. I'm working in an area in the Sierra Madre Foothills, specifically a community known as Bonamici. So where exactly is Bonamici? There's a couple ways of looking at it. I'm sure there's some people in the room that are like, oh, I know exactly where that is. But just really quickly, we are here, upper top corner in Tucson, and the map didn't show clearly, but Berenice is how it was written on the 1730 census. So I have two older names, if you would. One is from the 1730 census. The other here is Carol Riley's map that places some of the names of locations that were given to communities by the early explorers. We could also look at this region by ethno-linguistic groups. This is the area that was once occupied by the Opata peoples. Opata being a broad term for a diverse group of people that the Spanish all referred to under the title Opata. And I have here Sauer's 1934 map, which is one of the most frequently cited maps of the ethno-linguistic groups. And more recent by Cynthia Ratting's 1997 map. And we could look at it also by Archaeological Sites. This one was by Victoria Drists in her dissertation from 1979. And this one here should be recognizable to Professor Fish, and Dr. Villapando from illustrating where the Trincheras sites are located. These are different ways we can start thinking about this location. And there's a couple things that all these maps have in common. All these maps show the international boundaries. For some reason, that's one way people tend to conceptualize this region. It's not the US Southwest, it's the greater Southwest, or if you prefer, Northwest, right? We should all consider the greater Northwest, right? Sorry, lame humor. And then one of the ways that this area is known is by the river system. So even, not all maps have the rivers, but the rivers are an easy way to locate yourself in this region. And all the maps I've shown you so far, I know you can find others that don't, do feature the rivers. And then there is some variety on other things that might be shown, like state lines or place names. But this sort of base, the international boundaries and the rivers, are what information about the area is then overlaid on. The map's focal information is then overlaid on top of that information. But there's another way we can look at this. Instead of looking at a map, we can use words to describe the area. In particular, sorry, I didn't do that. In particular, Adolf Bandelier was one of the first researchers to document the area. And coming down the San Pedro River, crossing into this area, Bandelier described his hit by a major rainstorm, and he gets like congestion, he's kind of sick. And in March 6th, 1884, he wrote that he left at 11 a.m. The river is swollen and overflowing, extends beyond the banks in sheets and in some very shallow streams and channels. I reached Banamichi at 1 p.m., a small pueblo far different from the others in that it has a good number of substantial newly painted houses and is located on a bluff on the east side of the river. From it is a scene of exquisite beauty expands. The valley beneath is green with wheat fields, and beyond it to the southwest and to the west are the Sierra Odpede, the Sierra de Rayon, the Sierra Ures, and form dark green accented curtains. The valley is broad and entirely in culture. There is also, by culture, that means he's referring to agricultural. Perhaps there's another reason you might have heard a lot about this place called Banamichi lately. Right here, right? Can everyone see that? No, we need to get it on the big screen, right? Let's see if we can make it on the big screen. There we go. On Sunday, February 24th, Banamichi graced the front page of the Arizona Daily Star with a short article on the front page and a main article in the home life section. The article tells about Linda Ronstadt's return to the home of her ancestors, which the article describes as a, quote, small town along the Rio Sonora. Her grandfather was born in the ejido of Las Delicias, which is within the municipio of Banamichi. As Ernesto Portillo Jr., the editor for La Estrella de Tucson and author of the main article, notes, these heritage ties are not singular. The photographer who helped arrange the trip and author of the front page article, Bill Steen, also had grandparents born in Banamichi. As Portillo writes, Ronstadt's connection to the Rio Sonora is similar to that of countless families in Tucson and southern Arizona. Families go back and forth. This news article by Tucson-born journalist Portillo includes a heading about the magical connection, directly in the article it says magical connection, descendants feel about returning to their family home. He writes, the magic of Banamichi, where years of tradition remain strong, and as the tiny red-hot chiltepines that grow wild and the fiery bacanora distilled from Sonoran agave plants has lured Ronstadt back and will continue to pull on her emotions. This article presents a nostalgia for a tradition and a way of life of one's direct ancestors with a spicy wild food, traditional dance, and nostalgic music. In one sense, this description is completely accurate, but it doesn't tell the full story. Based on my repeated visits to the region since summer of 2016, the ties to the U.S. Southwest are irrefutable. Tucson is known to many of the residents of Banamichi, and many have family here. I've also heard many stories about siblings, cousins, and even children who were born or moved to southern Arizona. Along the river, chiltepines are grown, though I'm not sure I share the author's comfort in describing them as wild, since they are a valuable crop. And I have had the good fortune of being in town twice when the local dance troupe performs in the plaza for out-of-town guests. While there is a distinctive style preferred for music and dance, the dances the teams perform is different from the sort of up-tempo music you'll find playing loudly as live bands play on the main stages well past midnight in the main towns during major holidays and other events. Banamichi is a contemporary town with ties to the past, but expressions of tradition are as contemporary as performances that seem modern. As we see here, contemporary school children marching in their mariachi-style outfits for the Independence Day 16 de Septiembre parade. Let's also consider for a moment mining. As we see here, miners are walking in the same parade in their modern uniforms with their brightly covered protective coveralls and their hard hats. The main mine in town, Santa Elena, is now a hard rock mine. That is, for you who don't know hard rock mining, that's with the shaft, mine shafts, and underground excavation. The mine is wholly owned by First Majestic Silver Corporation, which is a Canadian-based company that runs 6 mines across Mexico. While contemporary operations began in 2011 with surface deposits and have expanded into these hard rock operations in 2014. While the heavy equipment used to extract gold may seem very modern, in Bonamici, mining is quite traditional. This area of the Sierra Madre foothills has been characterized by many mines dating back to the Reales de Mines, the royal mine districts and areas, shortly after colonization. Santa Elena's previous heyday dates back to the 19th century. On March 7th, 1884, Bandelier wrote about the Santa Elena mine that it is, the mine is large and was once rich in gold and silver. Today, it is, as usual, rich in, quote, large quantities of low-grade ore. It is not working today. That would be the day he visited. And they had stopped work since the 4th of February that year. What's not clear from that passage is if the mine had finally ceased operations in 1884, or if it was just not worth it for the people to be working for, about 2 months in 1884. It took about 130 years for the prices of ore to rise high enough to reopen the mine. But this rekindling of tradition has brought a new prosperity to a town. This, I don't know if any of you have visited Bonamici, but if you did in the past 10-ish years, this used to be an abandoned swimming pool in a park. And just this last summer and fall, 2018, thanks to money from the mining fund, this park was renovated into a football stadium, or soccer. And there is a nice, where's my stick? There's a nice walking track going around here. You can do laps if you want to run. It's nicely smoothly. And there's exercise equipment over here off the screen, and over here there's a nice playground equipment for kids, all freshly renovated as of 2018. The mining industry has definitely done a lot to help bring superficial signs of prosperity to the area, and has hosted events that, just before Christmas, they brought out big blow-up screens to show movies in the different communities to help improve favorable opinions about the mines. And there's a probably good reason why the mines might want to increase or improve their favorable impression, because on August 6th, 2014, about 40,000 liters of copper sulfate wastewater spilled from the Buena Vista de Cobre mine up in Cananea. Basically, the mine retaining pond in Cananea, the barrier wasn't sufficient, and it leaked directly into the Tinajas River, contaminating the Bacanuchi and Sonora rivers. The impact was worsened by the heavy rains from the remnants of Hurricane Odile. The full extent of this spill should not be minimized. There are everything from documentable moments where livestock was instantly sickened and killed to more colloquial stories about cancer clusters. I've met families where they were caring for a kid that developed cancer shortly after the spill. Is there a direct tie? That's always the story with cancer clusters. Can you ever actually say that A caused B? It's very hard to prove. The problem also may have been worsened by the fact that the government's response to this spill was sluggish. People heard about the spill from either by word of mouth or by actually seeing the water, the contaminated water, flow through their community. And the outrage has been echoed in multiple news articles, local activism. There is a documentary called El Drame Spill Doc. You can find on Facebook. It's also on Vimeo. And the rhetoric has been very dramatic. Arizona Daily Star again had a headline by Perla Treviso that said, "Livelihoods washed away by toxic spill in Sonora. The unknowns haunt Sonora Valley," adding that in this valley, quote, "everything came from the river, and that now all of that is gone." That was 2014. I've been back there. There's definitely stuff going on. It's not like a single incident can wash everything away, but the full impact still merits further discussion, and it's still sparking outrage. However, some of the impacts are sort of strange, as you can see in this photo. Immediately after the spill, this is a playground fountain at one of the schools in town. The fountain was capped. Kids were not supposed to drink from the fountains anymore. One of the fountains was directed to be irrigation water for the grass and such on the school ground. But back at that park that just got renovated in 2018, fountains are back in business. They're brand new drinking fountains were just added again last summer. So one of the questions that I'm still looking at, and I don't yet have a good answer to, is the question of the source of water for the town of Banamichi. Again, this is specifically for the municipio of Banamichi, not for other areas in the Rio Sonora. But in Banamichi, they rely on water from a seep spring known as the Basaran. I don't know if Basaran, if the Basaran is a word for springs in the Opata language. I've heard it interpreted possibly that way. Or if it's the proper name for that spring. Quite a few locations of springs are called Basaranes. And I did ask someone, like a good cultural anthropologist, what language is Basaran in, and someone said Spanish, and I actually heard that from 3 or 4 different people, but then couldn't find it in the Spanish-English dictionary, so it's been a word, whatever its origins was, that has been included into the Sonoran form of Spanish. Does the seep spring avoid some of the hassles or problems of mine spills? With a long tradition of mining, there might be grounds to say that drawing water from a spring helps circumvent immediate impacts, at least in the community of Banamichi. Again, I'm limiting it. Helps reduce some of the impacts of these mining spills. After all, Cananea has been around for 100 years. The Santa Elena is on the other side, and its impacts are another question, but it's not quite sure. I'm not quite sure about that one. Anyhow, sometime around 80 years ago, the water for the town side of Banamichi came directly from the river in a canal that diverted directly from the river, and the other side, the west side of the river, drew its water from the Basaran spring. The advantage of also drawing from a seep spring is you have a sort of continual flow of water from the groundwater table, while rainfall can be sporadic, and the river, as illustrated in the photos and in the narrative by Bandelier, the field notes by Bandelier, the amount of rain in the river does vary over time. So around 80 years ago, there was a pretty significant public works project that built a siphon, or a canal, a siphon underneath the river bottom, so that both sides of the river received water from the seep spring Basara. One of these dates, 1935, reflects that date, but it's interesting to know that the other side of the Basara is stamped 1965. So there was definitely some continuing renovation to the siphon system. But from here you can see this is the main canal, and there's a little gate, and this little gate leads to the other side of the river, and this main part leads to the town side. So most of the water ends up on the side where the main town of Banamichi is. These dates are relevant, but I want to take a moment to talk about the Rio Sonora or Serrana archaeological culture. I'm particularly fond of this map because you can get one guess where you think I found this map. It's kind of large, it's kind of obvious what it's centered on, with the Temple of the Cross, Pakime. This is actually from the museum in Pakime at Casas Grandes. And I think it's interesting that the map decided to label, what is the joke? This map is all over the map, right? Some of them are archaeological cultures, like Mogollon. I'm not even going to go into the controversy of that title right now on this region. But over here we have the Spanish pronunciation for autumn for this region. And then you have the contemporary Seri people on the coast, although they're labeled Seri as well. Key research in this area was led by Richard Pales. He initially conducted research in early 1970s and then went on to get a significant NSF grant from 1975 to 1979. And I'm going to focus right now on the output of that project for a moment. But I want to make sure I come back around and say that there is ongoing work. Even though I'm not going to talk about it right now tonight, my colleague Matt Pales has done, as you probably already know, quite a bit of significant work in the Montezuma Valley. And there's several other scholars in the US and Mexico that are working in this Rio Sonora Serrana culture. But focusing on this grant for a second, it was co-directed by Richard Pales, who if you go on NSF's website, you'll see Richard Pales' name, and that's it, as PI. But it was actually co-directed by Pales and Beatriz Banfield Cornejo. And they had a team that included several students. Some of the ones that have published publications you can look up include Daniel Reff and Victoria Drist's dissertation. They are housed at the ASM library. And William Doolittle was the principal surveyor in 1977 and 1978. Some of the major sites they reported on include the San Jose in the Bevilacqua area with 125 structures over about 25 square kilometers. The Las Delicias site with about 200 rooms. These were the two major, at least in the publications from the time, those were the two major sites that were discovered. There was also a site in La Mora and a site in Ojo de Agua, and not to mention other smaller sites. Las Delicias, to come back full circle, is again that place where Linda Ronstadt's family came from. And Las Delicias is on the other side of the river. I find this to be particularly fascinating because we don't really know, I don't really know, I hope to find out, maybe we'll find out, if the early settlement drew water from the Basaran Spring. But one thing I can say with a degree of confidence is that the older side of the community, I'd say town, but I'll just say community for a moment because town is a little bit ambiguous, was on the west side of the river, even though the contemporary, by contemporary I mean 1639 contemporary. So we're looking at least 400, almost 400 years contemporary. That is the newer side of town, and the older side of town would be on the other side of the river. And I'm a sociocultural anthropologist, as mentioned above, but it doesn't really take much ability to just look around the other side of the river. And this is one of those classic, you walk, you see a shard, you drop a coin, you take a photo. And it's much easier to spot shards and other clear contemporary signs of ceramic use on the west side of the river. But there's another thing I noticed, which was these strange door shapes. Kind of odd, right? I looked at them and I'm like, that kind of reminds me of something I've seen somewhere else. I'm not going to say where this is. I'm sure you might have a good idea. I'm not going to say it because I can't say for sure that there's a connection, but I'm going to strongly imply it by juxtaposing these two images. And so, being a good sociocultural anthropologist, I started asking around what was going on with these doors. One answer that a narrator shared with me is that this was a place to sit, that these little ledges allowed people to have a place to sit. Another narrative I heard was most common. Most people I talked to described it as an artifact of the construction with adobe. I've been to other places where there's adobe. I don't see these interesting shaped doors. There's a word that some people use that's T-shaped. That's not the word I heard used at all when I was talking to people. I only saw 2 in Bonamici, but these 2 are from the nearby community of Baviacora. And these odd-shaped doors were only on the older parts of town. So they were uncommon. When I first saw, the first place I noticed them actually was on a hotel. So my initial thought was, or I should say my initial hypothesis was, oh, what we're looking at here is something sort of like the Madra phenomena, where people are connecting with the archaeological culture and an architectural style. But as I talked to people, I heard no narratives or discussion that would support that hypothesis. That doesn't mean it isn't a possibility, but this particular house here in Green, I had the good fortune of talking to the owner, and basically when her family acquired it, her aunt acquired it, her 80-year-old aunt acquired it. It was already old and had been standing. I was also able to talk to her aunt, and basically, their best estimate is this particular house is over 100 years old. So I'm not entirely sure what it means, but it definitely merits further study. However, I did ask what people called it, and the word I heard was Puertas, ventanas, window doors, because there's a door and there's windows beside it. It's a logical name. And I don't have anything definitive to conclude, but I wanted to share that with you today, that this might be something that merits further looking at. I asked Matt Pales, Dr. Pales, if he's heard anything about that, and he hasn't yet, but now that I've shared it with him, I might find out more in the near future. I want to make sure I come around to talking about a concept that I'm sure, you've probably heard overzealous postmodern sociocultural anthropologists. They're always all about how we get stuck in what we say. But one of the key things I wanted to make sure I covered tonight is that this idea that our research doesn't happen in a vacuum. This project by Dr. Pales, Richard Pales, and Brandon Correa set a discourse that shapes how the community sees itself today. To put this a little bit of theory here, when you have research, it sets a discourse that is sometimes freeing, reproduces or proves something that a community has known, but also sometimes it can be combining. And King called it linguistic cages. One particular example here is a rock or a boulder that was incised with, I like to describe them as curvy lines and strange symbols. This particular boulder was known to the people in Bonamici before Pales and Banhef Cornea's team came along, and William Doolittle in particular published a few times on this particular boulder. It wasn't the first time it was published. It was initially published in the 50s. And I must emphasize again, members of the community knew about it. But Doolittle created a very interesting interpretation that perhaps this boulder was a map. Now you know why I started the whole presentation with maps, right? So now you've got a good sense of, well, you guys already know maps, but probably better than I do. But thinking about maps, Doolittle interpreted this as a map where the lines, these straight lines, were the river and the acequias. And then you have these circles with dots in the middle. He interpreted them as fields. And then these bullseye type things were the settlements. And he took that boulder and compared it to aerial photography. He drew a schematic of the river valley, again, the 1970s river valley, to illustrate that perhaps the petroglyph was the very first map of Bonamici. He used, for his interpretation, publications by Montjoy and Munn in Oaxaca and other parts of Mesoamerica. This petroglyph then supported this claim that there was irrigation in the valley. Again, the Pales, Brandhef Corneo did not find canals, archaeologically attestable canals in the area. But the petroglyphs supported the possibility of canals. And then by having this possibility that there was an advanced canal system in before the arrival, at this time that this boulder dates to. Again, you hear a vagueness. I'm not quite sure when this boulder is supposed to date to. Anyhow, the early explorers of the region described the possibility of triple cropping and that the Rio Sonora area was filled with large towns. Doolittle was able to take this boulder and say that it demonstrated that there was a possibility, maybe not quite as extreme, but double cropping or intercropping of maize or corn, and that it could support up to 100,000 residents in this Rio Sonora Bonamici extended area, which would have been much higher than some of the other interpretations before this project. As Doolittle notes, a populous, agriculturally productive area for the region is supported by some of these explorers who have been both, they have a colorful history, let's say, in the U.S. Southwest, and how their work has been interpreted. Marcos Deniza, for example, his reports helped lead to the Coronado expedition, where they were looking for Cibola, or several rich cities, which, as this audience probably knows, is directly correlated with Zuni, although there was probably a very significant cultural communication error going on here. Doolittle's research then supports this claim that there was a large population in this area, and that it was highly agriculturally productive. Now, I want to make sure I put a little bit more context in this, a little more context to his reports. That basically in the 1970s, that's when the paved road finally reaches Bonamici, and they are constructing a highway through the Rio Sonora in the 1970s. Before that, there was no paved road. Also, in the 1975-77 is when the canals were lined with concrete. I bet people here would probably be able to interpret this better than me, but I think the process of lining a canal with concrete might be problematic for identifying any archaeological features if that actual canal route was the same. So it's possible that these modernization projects could have obliterated some of the evidence that archaeological evidence of canals. It's also possible that the canals could have gone in a different route, or that we're seeing a reuse of canals. And as I mentioned above, the petroglyph was known to the community, and it was originally found near one of the old mills on a farm in the floodplain below. Now, I want to make sure, we talked about maps, and I'm coming back to it. I want you to notice this divot here, all right? And so people, which way is the correct way? If we look at the photo from when it was originally found in the floodplain, the direction that Doolittle used to interpret in the river and the canal, here's the divot. So the boulder is a 180 from the way it's originally found. So if it's still a contemporary map, it would be very difficult to read from the way it's currently being displayed because it has been completely rotated. Now, I want to make sure that I want to make sure that everyone here knows that William Doolittle was very careful in his interpretation. He wasn't saying that this is the way it is. He was saying this is a possible interpretation. The interpretation of this glyph as a map is no more than speculative, he said. He wrote something very similar in a different publication saying that the interpretation of this glyph as a map is admittedly speculative. So very similar wordings in two different publications. He wanted to make sure everyone knew this is a possibility. But what do people do when they hear something? Well, all graduate students and undergraduates do this all the time. They hear it, and they cite it, and they credit Doolittle. And so it becomes Doolittle's map. Maybe people aren't reading William Doolittle anymore. They're reading one of, I can think of off the top of my head, at least 3 publications that directly cite Doolittle's map. It comes part of the discourse, and all of a sudden this is the map of Bonamici, and Doolittle said it was. Again, Doolittle was speculative. I want to make sure that's clear. But now we have this first map of Bonamici, and it isn't just sitting out there in the floodplain anymore. If you've ever been there, there is a main highway right here where I'm walking. So if you're coming through town along the Rio Sonora, it's very difficult to miss this large statue. Over here is an OSHA, which is sort of like Circle K or what's the other popular, 7-Eleven. And if this were the DSCC State of September, 4th of July equivalent, the Independence Day, right about here would be the big stage where the municipal president, the mayor equivalent, is giving the Grito de Dolores, the big speech, and then you get fireworks going off, behind this petroglyph. So this is like the center of town. This particular statue and fountain was created in 1989, which coincidentally, again, correlation is not causality, but I'm hinting at something very strongly. Here's a possible linkage. After the publications by William Doolittle and by other members of the research team, ever ironically, the last time unless I'm missing any publications by Professor Doolittle, there is other work he's done on canals, but the last time he directly speaks of this particular petroglyph, the last publication is dated 1988. The fountain was created in 1989. And the reason this fountain was created was the 350th anniversary of the founding of the Pueblo. The highway was renamed after Father Bartolomé Castañeros, and each of these statues is supposed to represent the 4. They're inspired by what the Opata might look like, sort of as a sculpture. So there's a degree of creative freedom in that. And each of those 4 sculptures is supposed to represent the 4 towns of Aconchi, Huepic, Bonamici, and Sinoquipe. And in the middle, that's supposed to be a corn stalk that's supporting the petroglyph. It looks like it's on the shoulders, but actually the figures are supporting around the corn stalk. And more important than if the interpretation of this as the first map is the fact that it is currently in a very prominent place in town. So when I'm out there as a sociocultural anthropologist and asking people about the town of Bonamici, its history, one of the answers I get is the history of the town is in the plaza. I'm directed to this monument that creates a narrative that reproduces a story about how Bonamici has always been agriculturally productive and inhabited by significant communities. As one individual put it, this individual was a leader in the water users group. The origin of so water users, really quick backing up a second, I'm sorry I forgot to say, basically the canals have to be managed, and members who use water from the canals to irrigate their fields are part of a water users group. So I asked, what's the history of the water users group? And I was told the origin of the water users group then was with the origin of Bonamici. It's the same thing that the Piedra Historica, the historic rock, is saying, that there was a version of the irrigation district that was told to us today by the petroglyph. In other words, the petroglyph shows an irrigation system that is directly the origin of the contemporary users group. And when I talk to most irrigators, they, again, look right to the petroglyph to say, yes, this is part of our usos and costumbres, our traditional uses and customs. And it's interesting, this dates to 83, and that data I pointed out to you seems to be more in the right direction, so it sort of aligns to the way it was originally. And and that is a crest for the municipio of Bonamici. So basically, this narrative is directly linked to this monument. It's not the only way the petroglyph, though, can be interpreted. how can you know for sure what anyone has carved into a rock and what message they intended to send unless A, you can go interview them, which is great. I do recommend talking to people who are still around if you can talk to the author who creates something. Although any English person will tell you that sometimes when you write something, it takes on a life of its own. So artists do intentionally evoke a degree of multiple interpretations. For something back this far, who knows? One way it's been described is as indigenous art, opata art, by Sutton, who was a graduate student at ASM. And I think one of the things that I found very interesting is that most people I talked to in town, and just quickly went with the interpretation. Not that they knew that Doolittle's name offhand, but that was just what the monument meant. However, I found it to be interesting that it was individuals with more advanced years, more years experience, I suppose, that were more skeptical of this interpretation. However, I do want to say, end my presentation by mentioning that there are some parallels in some of the reports between how irrigation was done in the past and how it's done today. From Doolittle, which isn't that far long ago, just a few decades ago, right? He described how the water comes from 4 sources: direct precipitation, stream flow, and groundwater. And that regulation of the amount of water in each field was done by opening and closing canals. The canals were closed by backfilling dirt at the appropriate point, and then this fill was removed to open the canal. Doolittle then hypothesized that pre-Hispanic residents might have multi-cropped maize or intercropped using this technology. He drew from Peppercorn's reports to argue that there continuity in irrigation, but then he added that such practices remain unconfirmed. The pattern Doolittle described is nearly identical to what I have observed in the field. This is what I am going to put in a forthcoming article. On May 17th, I joined Mickey, which is a pseudonym, Jaime, and we went down to a milpa, where a friend of theirs, Mateo, was irrigating a field at 8 p.m. at night. Mickey was a farmer from Mexico, and Jaime and Mateo were regadores, or individuals hired to water. Mateo was wearing wading boots as he was out prepared for the task, while the rest of us wore street shoes and were not prepared for the muddy water we would soon find. Illuminated by the light of the stars, Mateo worked without a flashlight. The manglas were separated by earthen beams that encouraged the water to pool in the appropriate long, narrow basins. One side of the mangla was a minor earthen canal which drained water from the main canal for a short distance away. When it was time, Mateo showed me how he changed manglas. Near a secondary canal, he moved a heavy-duty woven plastic sheet supported by a wooden lattice, not unlike the kinds of lattices Doolittle reported in 1980, and used that to temporarily close off the canal so the next patch could be watered in the correct way. Regadores like Mateo must build small dams and carve down portions of the berm to allow the water to flow into particular pots. With a shuttle in hand, Mateo set a few scoopfuls of dirt to close the old patch and clear the new one, as he changed directions of the water from one parcel to another. I hope to be able to find, when I began this investigation, some evidence or some information that hopefully archaeologists could be able to use to help interpret or understand how people may have irrigated in the past. Unfortunately, I was not able to go back that far, but I was able to find a direct continuity to at least 40 years ago. And I was able to find that the way people manage the water seems to be based on practical experience with the watershed and in the land. So while more research needs to be conducted, I found that there is definitely some wisdom drawn from the not too distant past that may or may not be able to be applied to the near future, especially with ongoing threats from mining or possible climate change. Most importantly, the narratives told by the petroglyph helped reify a deep sense of community and continuity to a past. And I'd like to thank you all for coming out to talk to me. I need to acknowledge, thank you Archaeological as well as the Spicer Foundation, School of Anthropology, Social and Behavioral Research Science for helping fund my research, and my advisors and my mentors in my communities, Maribel especially, and yeah, everyone here, thank you. I believe we have time for questions.
Yeah, what are the photographs that they just gathered on the I'm sorry, I missed it, but on the boulder that has the map, it looks like on the side.
There's more petroglyphs, right?
Right.
That's why I decided to include this
Right
one.
there.
Yeah. So it continues on, and it's not in Doolittle's reports. But I'm not sure how that would represent a continuity if this is the north if it's inverted, so this would be upstream of that part. So possibly if we were looking for where, if it's a map, which is admittedly speculative, the Basarone Spring would be further up here too. But yeah, I'm not sure. Does that answer?
Was the boulder radio propagated at all?
I don't have that information. As far as I know, I don't. But that would be a good question. Yeah.
And then if your informants have a history of how the irrigation practices changed during floods, a lot of these valleys in this region have gone through a period of arroyo cutting in the late 1800s that kind of reorganized how they did irrigation and left stranded canals. So they might have, older canals.
Absolutely. As you can see, I'm standing, maybe you can't see. I'm standing here in the river looking up at an old piece of canal that no longer can be used because the river has cut down so much further from there. This area is also known for its mills, many of them which were operated by water power. And while the main reason most of the mills shut down was changes in government policy regarding and lower prices of flour, ground flour, one of the things that, as you mentioned, one of the older narrators shared with me is that some mills, the water level just dropped due to arroyo cutting. So it isn't exactly about irrigating fields, but it meant that the arroyo arroyo incision negatively impacted the ability of that water system to work.
Did you find any evidence that pre-contact peoples had access to the wheel?
That's a good question.
We don't see that in the Hoboken, so I'm just wondering if they had the wheel, which is very handy for construction.
Yeah.
And the other thing I might say, I've done a lot of work in Sonora, Baja, and Venezuela, and also around in California. And a lot of people did in the structures like that Ventura business you had. If you had something really valuable and it was big and you didn't want people to steal it,
Yep.
you built the door in such a way that you have to tear down the wall and take out the diesel generator or the imported furniture from Italy, like in the mansion in Northern California. So a lot of the old construction back 100 and more years ago was built kind of screwy at doorways to kind of make it hard to steal things. I wonder if you've seen anything along those lines.
That's really interesting. The mills that have had a lot of expensive equipment in them, I don't see these doorways on those mills. But if you think about heavy furniture, these are the larger houses in town, so it is possible that could be, by having a narrowing door, you couldn't get the heavy furniture through the doorway. So I wouldn't rule it out as a possibility, but it isn't consistent with the mills where the the valuable equipment for grinding wheat would be.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You had a photo of a small canal running along next to like a cliff or a sharp hill.
Uh-huh.
You know where that was?
Which is it? Let's go this way. Not this one. This one? I think that. Not like this. Oh, sorry. Not this one, right?
No. Did you go to Tutuachi?
The what?
Did you go to Tutuachi?
No, I did not. All of the photos I'm using in this particular presentation are directly from the Municipio of Banamichi. With the exception, of course, of the newspapers, which are from Tucson. Sorry, I didn't mean to. But I will go there in the future. Tupachi?
Tutuachi.
Tutuachi. Thank you.